Today is November 3rd, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. When I started my classical studies as a college student, I was still only 19, maybe 20 years old. But I had a goal. At that time in my life, I was a Protestant, and I wanted to be a Christian minister. I wanted to study, to prepare for seminary, and devote my life to Christian pastoral ministry. That was my goal. And the men that I looked up to as models, who I wanted to imitate and follow, were some of the early American ministers in the Northeast, men like Jonathan Edwards. And over in England, men like John Owen and Richard Baxter, men who were Puritans. I admired the Puritans, I admired their learning, I admired their simplicity of life and their simple Christian devotion, and I wanted to be like those men. I pursued classical studies with that objective in mind. I wanted to master classical studies as they did, and then devote my life to theological studies. I had a very clear goal for why I wanted to study the classics, and that goal, because I had a practical goal or end that I sought, it gave me a focus and I could say something of a touchstone for all of my studies. It was where the rubber met the road. That would probably be the most apt illustration. I had a reason for desiring classical studies, and therefore the studies that I pursue had to fulfill that objective. Now, when I looked at the curriculum at the university, most of the courses that were offered by the classics department weren't intended for that end. They were intended for more of an academic classical education. The authors that were studied in the classics department were not the authors that were studied by Puritans at schools like Harvard or Oxford back in the 1700s. So the classics department, the classics curriculum at the university wasn't what I desired to study to serve my end. Now, fortunately for me, I had a good reputation, and I had professors who were generous and willing to work with me. And they actually allowed me to pursue the studies that I desired through independent study arrangements between the professors and myself privately. And so I was able to begin at that time to answer questions like, what should I study? What authors should I study? What books should I study? How should I study? And so on. I had to start answering those questions as I was just beginning to even do the studies myself. And so I would go back into historical biographies or records from schools of the past, and I would learn about the curricula that they offered, what books, what sources were studied, how they were studied, and so on. And I used that as my own curriculum plan for my own classical education. I had great success in that education. I went on to be a straight-A student, was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa. But the reason why my classical studies were successful was because I had a clear, practical end to those studies. The problem in modern studies for many students, especially when we get into classical studies or philosophy, is that there's no practical end. And these subjects, as you know if you've begun studying them, they're infinite. They go on forever. You can study literature and philosophy and languages for your entire life and never feel like you've scratched the surface. It just gets deeper and broader and deeper and broader over time. Without a practical end for our studies, we just sort of tread water in an ocean in the dark, as if we were lost at sea in the middle of the night, treading water with no ability to know where we were going, how far we had traveled, how far we need to go. We're just treading water for the sake of treading water. And that's really not how classical studies work. And yet, as I said, for most students, this is, especially in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, if there's no practical end for these studies, it's just treading water in an infinite ocean of information. And that can never last for long. It's not sustainable. It's not practicable. And so students have to develop some practical end. They have to have some objective for their studies that's practical. And this practical end may change over time. They may begin with one end, achieve that end, and then begin to focus on another higher end and continue like that through their careers. So I'd like to encourage students to have a practical end or objective in their studies and to understand that there can be intermediate ends that are used as stepping stones to long-term ends, which they consider final destinations. Now, one such practical end could be a high school diploma. Another practical end could be college admission. Another practical end could be admission to graduate school. Another practical end could be to receive a master's degree in classics. But there has to be some practical end, and these practical ends, like I said, can consist of intermediate ends, but we have to answer the question, what is the final practical end of these classical studies? No one needs to study the classics to be saved, so we can't say, I want to study the classics that I may inherit eternal life. Classical studies are not a prerequisite for eternal life. So that kind of lazy Sunday school talk doesn't solve the problem. There has to be a practical end for these studies. And most students have no answer if they were asked what that practical end might be. And I'd like to encourage students to think about that, to discuss that. I'd like to challenge parents to talk about these things with their children, because there must be a practical end for these studies, because they can go on forever. You can study the classics your entire life, and therefore studying the classics to study the classics really doesn't provide an end to aim at or goal. And as I said, they can be intermediate goals, for, step by step, moving through different phases of life, having different practical goals at different points while moving towards a higher goal. But there must be goals for students to aim at and achieve, and they must be practical. For me, as I said, it was to study the classics, to earn a classics degree, and then to go on to seminary. That was my goal. As I began studying the classics, my thoughts about religion and life began to change and develop, and they eventually led me out of Protestantism into Catholicism. So my initial practical end was to study the classics and obtain a classics degree with an anticipated next end of going to seminary, receiving my theological degree, and then pursuing ordination and working as a Christian minister. But my classical studies, as I achieved my first intermediate end, I was led to reconsider what my next end might be and adjust my course. And so at each step along the way, I've continued to learn, continued to grow, and then reassess what my goals are. But I've always had a practical goal, even as I do today. Everything I do is aimed at certain practical objectives that I have, and they provide focus for my studies. They allow me to set timelines and plan and prioritize my studies so that I can get things done presently while continuing to move forward towards longer-term final destinations, as it were. Now, when we talk about these things, many students have no idea what their options even are, and this is a big part of the problem in modern Catholic education. There's very little talk about final destinations because there are false ideas about vocation that get mixed into these discussions that don't bring clarity but actually cause confusion. And that's one of the reasons we can tell ideas about vocations are false is because they lead students into confusion rather than into clarity. Vocation simply means an invitation or a calling. It doesn't mean some predestined future occupation that God has assigned to a person, which leaves a student in danger of missing his calling by not finding the right destination, as if it's some sort of scavenger hunt to discern God's will for our lives. The vocations that God gives us are quite simple. They're based on God's will, which is revealed to us in the sacred scriptures. Yesterday, I should say last night, I had a long discussion with one of my sons. He's 16 years old, and he wants to be a Marine. He's very disciplined, very serious, very sober, very virtuous, and his desire is to be a Marine. And I wanted to talk to him about these things because recently he had said something vaguely about God having a purpose for his life. And I wanted to talk about that and clarify that and sort of gauge his thoughts as to what he's thinking about, because this talk is common today and it's meaningless and vague, and I want it to be clear. So we talked about what it means to be a soldier. What is the purpose of a soldier? Whether it's God's will for a person to be a soldier. And as we dug into these practical questions, I could see that he hadn't really thought through them. And so we talked about the purpose of a soldier being one who serves the executive branch of government, at least in America, to enforce the law, to carry out the law of our country. And I asked him if he knows to what a soldier commits himself when he becomes a soldier, and he didn't really have a clear sense of that. And I said, a soldier promises to defend the Constitution of the United States of America. And so I asked him, have you studied the Constitution? And he said, no, not yet. As I said, he's 16. So I said, how would you be able to commit to defend the Constitution before you know what the Constitution is? And as we talked about it, even he realized that hardly any of the men and women joining the military and taking up the occupation of soldiers in our country have studied the Constitution, and yet they ignorantly make a promise to defend it when they take their pledges as soldiers. And we started to talk about the purpose of soldiers and what they're for. We talked about how the purpose of a soldier is to protect the common good. And again, the idea of the common good was something he wasn't yet familiar with. And as we start to unravel these things, we see lots of pockets and areas of ignorance that need to be filled in through study. But what's important, the advantage that he has, is that he has a practical objective. And that practical objective becomes something of a line by which everything else, or to which everything else can be related. And so having that practical objective, saying that I desire to become a soldier, I desire to serve our country in the military, even more specifically, I desire to be a Marine, provides us with a starting point and a point to constantly come back to practically as we discuss what should be studied, how it should be studied, when it should be studied, to what extent it should be studied, and so on. Having that practical aim is really the most important point. Now, as we engage in these studies, as I said before, as we engage in these studies and begin to learn and grow in our understanding, we may change the practical end. And that's a good thing because our practical end may become more prudent. But there has to be a practical end to get started and to use as sort of the guideline through these studies. For my son, it's a desire to be in the Marines. For me, before I even was interested in Christian ministry, it was to get into medicine. I was actually a pre-med student, but I had aspirations that turned out to be more noble than medical work because I thought to myself, I really don't want to devote all of my energy and my life to helping take care of the body. I would rather devote myself to take care of the soul. And that's what motivated my interest in Christian ministry and ultimately into classical studies. So as we study, we have a practical goal that we aim at, but as we study, our studies begin to direct that goal more prudently and help us to make discerning judgments along the way. But having a practical goal to begin is essential, and most students don't. And this is the chief source of confusion in their studies. And this is true for students of all ages. I often get emails from adult men who will ask me where they should begin or what they should study. And the first thing I do is respond to them and simply ask, what are your goals? What are you trying to accomplish? Because the studies are infinite. They're infinite. You have to have some practical objective to aim for, which then would direct you to certain studies. So it doesn't start with study as an end in itself. And I know it's common for people to say things like that, like we should study for the sake of studying. And that's foolishness. That's not true. We should study presently because we're creatures of time and space. We should study for some practical objective and then continue to clarify and adjust that practical objective as we go, or achieve that practical objective and then establish a next practical objective and go along over time. So that's what needs to be done, and most students don't have that. Most students don't have a clear practical objective, and they need to get one in order to progress in their studies, to make order of their studies, to prioritize their studies, and so on. Now, in modern society, I know that students are going to come in and they're going to be talking about modern careers. They're going to be talking about engineering and medicine and law, maybe. Even law these days is too abstract and philosophical for most students. Most of them can't think beyond engineering or computer programming or something like that. I would like to help students or recommend that students understand what options there are with practical objectives so that they can have something to focus on and realize, and this is very important, realize that it's not wise to think that you've got your final destination figured out when you haven't studied yet. And so you should establish as your practical objectives things that you must do and leave off more mature ends for appropriate times. For example, when students think about college studies, they immediately begin thinking that they're going to choose a career and choose a major and then apply to college to study in that field. And they imagine that they're going to get admitted to college and then begin medical studies, or begin engineering studies, or begin legal studies, and that's not how college works. The first half of a college education is general studies, and the second half of a college education is more specialized vocational or professional studies. That's how a college undergraduate program works. And the thinking behind that is that the general education provides you with a general preparation for any occupation, but more importantly, it helps you to gain some familiarity with all of the options that are available. So before your final 2 years, before you make that final commitment to some specific practical end, you've been introduced to a wide range of possible ends and can make a more informed choice as to what you should pursue. And this is what students go through. My daughter, Mary, wanted to be an art major, and so began her college studies with a desire to study art. She took a biology class in her freshman year and loved it so much that she decided it was actually biology that she wanted to study. She would never have known that without a general education. And that's the purpose of the first 2 years of college is to provide that general education, to give students a familiarity with all of the different fields of study and opportunities available so that they can make an intelligent decision for the final 2 years of their undergraduate studies, and then make decisions for whatever future pursuits they want to undertake when they complete those undergraduate studies. That's how college is meant to work, and it's very prudently arranged if we allow it to work that way. But there still must be practical ends. For students, for teenage students, the practical end that should be first in their mind is completing a high school diploma. It's very practical, very simple, easy to manage. The requirements are very objective, and it, as I said, provides priorities for right now, where the kids are right now. Complete the requirements for a high school diploma. Very simple, easy to achieve, practical, objective. With that in view, the next question begins to arise, which is what next? What are we going to pursue after the high school diploma? And I like to think about college decisions using the military as an illustration. In the military, there's two divisions. There are soldiers and there are officers. If you want to be a soldier, you can enter full-time active duty when you're 18 years old and go and fulfill your end. You can go be a soldier. And by your activity as a soldier, if you live and act nobly as a soldier, you can climb through the ranks and rise up in the military as a soldier. That's one option. The other option is to desire to be an officer in the military, and if you desire to be an officer in the military, you'll likely be recommended to go to college and take advantage of something like an ROTC program. This decision in the military, in a military career, is similar to the decision in all careers. The question is whether you want to be a soldier or an officer. So if you think about trades, some may say, well, I want to work in carpentry, or I want to do electrical work, or I want to do plumbing, or whatever the field may be. There are still, in those fields, there are still soldiers and officers. The officers are those who go and study engineering and learn the sciences and arts of those different fields. The soldiers are those who go and simply get to work. So there's different options, but notice that these are practical objectives. And my advice for any student who has the opportunity to pursue a college education, that he should do so. And I know that it's popular today among the ignorant social media mob to criticize and speak against college studies, but you'll often notice that the people who do so are either those who, A, have received the advantages of having gone to college and now pretend that it was a waste of time, even though they received those benefits, or those who didn't do it and now pretend that it's better not to. Neither of them are good arguments. If you can obtain a college education, you should. And not only that, but if you can obtain a college education, you should seek it from the best university you can possibly gain access to. And so that should be considered in the practical objectives of a student's studies. So that adds a challenge to their studies while in high school. It's one thing to get a high school diploma. It's another thing to gain admission to college. It's another thing to gain admission to an elite college. It's another thing to gain admission to an elite college and thrive at an elite college. All of these things have to be taken into consideration from a child's youngest years. When I think about educating a student who's 14, 15, 16, I take a high school diploma for granted. I take college admission for granted. What I'm concerned about is what college, and what I'm also concerned about is winning awards and succeeding at that college, hopefully a most selective college. That's what should direct the decisions that students make, the things they work on, the subjects they study, and so on. Not getting into college, you can go to a local college that admits 85% of the students who apply. There's no challenge in quote-unquote going to college in modern America because there are colleges that admit anyone who signs up. The challenge really is gaining admission to the best possible college that will give you the most possible advantages. That's the challenge. That's what we should be talking about. So when we talk about practical objectives, the very first objective, most immediate and practical, should be to complete the requirements for a high school diploma. The second practical objective should be to gain admission to the most selective college possible. And the third objective should be to thrive, to succeed at that college and open up a new set of doors for the next set of practical objectives. That's how students should think, and that's where classical liberal arts studies begin to make sense. Classical liberal arts studies don't make sense if you simply want a high school diploma. Classical Catholic studies don't make sense if all you want to do is get into college. Where classical Catholic studies begin to make sense is when you start talking about gaining admission to an extremely selective college that offers you the most and greatest advantages and thriving at that college from the moment you sit down in your first class, preparing for success in college at an elite school. That's what should direct classical Catholic studies. So those are my concerns, that students have practical objectives and that those objectives be placed where they should be for students who have access to education. And that those high standards, all of which are objective, all of which have specific requirements, specific things to target in our activities, and then allow that to direct those activities today. Without that, we're just treading water in an ocean that's infinite. And that can't be done. It's just not reasonable or practical or productive. So to have those kinds of objectives and to resist this ignorant mob spirit that suggests that making goals like that is somehow worldly or vain. Students who have access to classical Catholic education should most certainly be considering the most selective colleges. And if they're not, I really wonder why they're interested or why their parents are interested in classical studies in the first place. And to be honest, I would say that most of the students who don't have ambitious goals never make progress in classical Catholic studies because everyone involved knows they have no use of them, no taste for them, and so on. They need to have practical objectives, and they should be practical objectives that are appropriate for students with access to classical Catholic education. Those goals will provide all of the intermediate objectives that they aim for day by day, that make their decisions for them with respect to their studies, priorities in studies, how they should study, what the standards should be for their studies, and so on. It begins with those practical ends. Now, when it comes to further ends like career options, many students are clueless, as are their parents. I talk to students about this quite frequently because I don't think students understand what options are available. I chose, as I said, to be a classicist. And I did so with thoughts about Christian pastoral ministry at the time. But at the same time, I knew that I could just devote my life to classical studies, and that was also attractive to me. And actually, as I moved away from Protestantism, I realized that that's what I was going to have to do because I was already married by the time I was finishing my undergraduate studies. And so I started to think about whether I could devote myself to classics as a means of making a living, to be a full-time professional classicist. And I can remember the thought that I had, and I may have shared this in another talk, but I was listening to the New York Philharmonic Orchestra one day as I was driving to school, and I could hear the piccolo player, and I said to myself, there was a day when that musician chose to take up the study and practice of the piccolo, which is a very obscure instrument, and yet he knew that if he became the best piccolo player, he could have a career playing the piccolo in the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. And I realized that the key in these discussions about careers, the key is not, can you get a job in a certain field? That's not the question, and anyone asking that question is bound to fail. The question is, can you be the best in that field? That's what the student should be asking. Can I be an elite classicist? Can I be the best classicist? Can I be the best Latin teacher, the best Greek teacher, the best philosophy teacher, the best classical literature teacher? That's what a student needs to ask, because that's where a career in a certain field comes from. It comes from being the best in that field. And that could be the best universally, or it could be the best in a certain area. But the question is not, can I get a job in this field? But can I be the best in this field? And that's what students should be asking themselves. If there's a field that they enjoy, that they're interested in, the question they should ask is, can I become the best in this field? Now, I would like to focus in the future in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy of apprenticing and training students who want to be professional classicists. That's a personal interest of mine. I desire to develop a small group of students who desire to devote their whole lives to classical studies, at least at this point in their life, who have ability in these studies, who have interest in these studies, and who want to study and work to become the best in their generation at these studies. That's the question that we should be asking. And as I said, as far as classical studies goes and classics as a profession, I would like to personally apprentice students and help them to become professional classicists in the future. Classical studies are very important across all subjects, not just for those who desire to focus on classical studies, but any subject, because the principles that are learned through classical studies can be applied either directly or indirectly to any other field. In most fields, the applications are by means of analogy. The principles that are learned in classical studies can be applied by analogy to other fields. And this has been the benefit of classical studies all through history. Men have used the wisdom that they've learned through classical studies and through the study of ancient Greek and Roman civilization to apply that knowledge to their own circumstances, their own problems, their own challenges, and so on, and find solutions by means of analogy. Obviously, this is true in politics, where most of the founding fathers were classically educated and used their classical education to solve problems in government that were never faced before. The circumstances in America were unique, they were unprecedented, and yet classically educated men, by means of analogous thinking, could apply lessons learned through classical studies to the circumstances of modern America and establish what they consider to be a more perfect form of government than any other that had previously existed. And 250 years later, it looks like they were right. And these were men like John Adams, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and so on. They used classical studies in creative ways to solve modern crises. And that's the value and merit of classical studies in all fields, in all subject areas. When we get into our actual professional work, no matter what field we may be in, we've got to find new and creative solutions to problems that give us something to offer, whether it's a product or a service. It's got to be superior to other products and services. We've got to solve problems creatively, with creative thinking. And modern education doesn't prepare students for the kind of thinking that's necessary to solve those problems. If you look at the men and women who are solving modern problems, you'll often find that they're not your normal modern school graduates. They're usually people who had other influences in their lives, who think outside the box, who spend a lot of time talking about philosophical ideas or historical ideas, and they use those ideas to solve new problems in creative ways. That kind of thinking doesn't come through modern K-12 education. It comes primarily through classical education, which focuses on the universal arts like grammar and reasoning and rhetoric and mathematical arts, and then applies those general principles to specific modern problems. That's the difference. When we look at subjects like algebra or calculus and we ask, where did these subjects come from? They came from classically educated men. Classically educated men were the ones who developed calculus. And that's sort of the elephant in the room that no one in modern schools wants to talk about. That the great men we talk about and admire, the men who built our country, the men who advanced so many different fields of what's considered modern learning, were all classically educated. And it was because they learned to think a certain way, their minds were filled with certain examples of men and women, certain principles of learning, certain arts and sciences that can be applied to an infinite number of different specific fields of work and learning. And so the benefits of classical studies can be direct if one desires to devote himself to professional classical studies as a profession. They can also be indirect if one applies lessons learned through classical studies in an analogous way to new problems requiring new creative solutions. That's the art of invention, as the ancient philosophers like Cicero used to speak of. But what's most important is that kids develop in their studies some practical objective. It doesn't need to be a final destination, even though it can be sort of a vague, general sense of a final destination, but the intermediate steps are going to be the same for most future destinations. And those are the things that the kids should focus on first. For adults coming into these studies, they have to have some practical objective for them. If a 40-year-old man decides he wants to begin classical studies, he has to answer the question, for what end? What's the goal of these studies? And only when he can answer that question can he begin to make decisions and prioritize studies, because studying as an adult is very different than studying as a child. Most adults don't have the time children have, but they have an advantage in experience and strength to make progress more efficiently than young children can. So there are pros and cons. It's also possible for an older man who's already established himself financially and has a real responsible leisure to now devote that leisure to studies that he was not able to pursue at an earlier time in his life. So there are all different circumstances, but what is common in all of them for success in studies is that there must be some practical end that a student focuses on and seeks to achieve immediately. Otherwise, he just treads in an infinite ocean of information and never really accomplishes anything. So we've got to be practical, But at the same time, we also need to think about long-term destinations we'd like to pursue, and remember that our studies, as we grow in wisdom and experience, our studies will direct us in refining or refocusing our destination. And we need to allow that to be done. Now, there are a million things we could talk about here, but it starts with a general sense of what that final destination might be, whether one wants to devote his life to religion, whether one wants to devote his life to classical studies, whether one wants to devote his life to modern research and scientific investigations, whether one wants to devote himself to a learned profession like medicine or law or education or politics. These are the kinds of questions that students should be asking, and their answers should be vague at this point in their life. But if we can begin to start to zoom in and focus on those ends with general ideas about those destinations, we can begin to align intermediate objects that are necessary, regardless of the final destination, and set them as short-term goals for students to focus on. And that's what creates order and a sense of achievement in studies. And students have to have that. Students have to have a short-term goal to aim at so that they can have a sense of completion, while they also develop a long-term goal to aim at that directs their present studies. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, I have a personal desire. I was talking with this about my wife this morning, actually, because I've been chewing on the idea for a long time. And yesterday I was reading the biography of John Adams for my own studies. And I came upon a point in his life where he took on a couple of young men as assistants in his law practice. And he explains that in exchange for their assistance, he took responsibility for their education. That's what it said in his biography. And as I heard that, I thought to myself, that's something that I could see developing in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy for students who had the ability and the interest, who had the freedom, their parents' consent and support to pursue classical studies with a view to possibly going on to college for classical studies at an elite university. I could arrange a means by which those students can assist me in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy while I take responsibility for their classical education. It would be a small number of students. I don't know if these students even exist in this generation. So there's no certain number or anything. There'd be no quota because I don't know if there's one even. But if there were students who wanted to devote themselves to classical studies with a view to going on to college and majoring in classics and studying classics, at least for undergraduate studies, I would be interested in having them assist me in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and directing their education to prepare them for such a college future. I think we have to realize that when you talk about engineering and computer programming and these popular secular professional options, you're entering into a competitive field where Christians are often at a disadvantage. One doesn't need to be a Christian to be a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer. One doesn't need to be a Christian to do these things, nor are they necessarily corollary to Christian studies. When I need a professional to do something, I don't think about whether he's a Christian or not. I think about whether he is skilled and has a good reputation. That's the only thing I think about. That's true even in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy with contract labor that I employ for different tasks. I have no interest in making a deal with a Christian, because I've found that to be a terrible approach to these things in my own experience. I look for the most competent and skilled and motivated worker. When we look to classical studies do give Christian students an advantage. Christian students, especially Catholic students, they do have an advantage in classical studies because classical studies do relate directly to Catholic studies and Catholic life and culture. One of the principal motives for classical studies is knowledge of the sacred languages, of Greek, for example, for the New Testament, of Latin for the language of the Church, and then eventually Hebrew for the language of the Old Testament, although that's not as urgent a need and would really belong more to a pursuit of ancient studies rather than classical. But classical studies do have a direct connection to Catholic studies and culture and life, and so Catholic students have an advantage over non-Catholic or non-Christian studies when it comes to classical studies. There are very, very few students interested in classical studies from a secular perspective, actually interested in becoming masters of Greek and Roman culture and Greek and Latin languages. There are very, very few purely classical studies interests in this generation, in our society. Most of the students in classical studies have some connection to Christianity, and that's what directs them to classics. So I would argue that students being raised in Catholic families, students being homeschooled as Catholic students, should consider classical studies as a college major because they have a real advantage in those studies, and by focusing on them and becoming the best in their generation at these studies, I believe that there are many opportunities for Catholic students to be admitted to elite universities by committing themselves to classical studies. Many classics departments struggle to even find students in modern society, and I believe that there are many opportunities, especially in elite universities, many opportunities for Catholic students to gain admission through classical studies. And I would like to help prepare students to pursue those opportunities. So that's an option, a practical objective that I would like to offer as one who is a professional classicist. I would like to offer that opportunity to students who have that desire and have that ability and have that support from their parents to get after it and pursue it, but it would be very rigorous. And it would only be possible for the most motivated students. I know when I was 19 years old, I would have sacrificed everything for that opportunity. If there was a professor who said to me, if you will do these things and work with me and do this, I will direct your studies, and I would have signed up. I would have slept in his office if I needed to. That's how committed I was. And so if there is an interest among students for something like that, and it can be done remotely, but it would be private, it'd be very intensive and private, I would be content to take on something like apprentices for the work of a classicist and have them assist me behind the scenes in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and work their way up, starting with simple tasks, moving up into more complex tasks. In exchange for that work, I would direct their studies and help them prepare for admission to an elite school for a future in classical studies, at least for the undergraduate level. But to get back to the main topic of the talk, parents have to discuss with students their practical goals and set out a roadmap for them so they have something to focus on presently. They have deadlines and time frames or milestones to aim at, and there should be a map for what needs to be done, because these things directly relate to time and space and resources, and we've got to make sure that priorities are taken care of first, and then we reassess options after each milestone is reached. Too many students are enrolled in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy with no real clue what they're trying to do, and it can be seen by the chaos and disorderliness, the aimlessness of their studies. That has to change, and that's true whether you're an 8-year-old student or a 68-year-old student. You've got to have some practical objectives for your studies. And lastly, I'll say something quickly about adult students who come in. When adult students come in, they often get started with courses I recommend, and I recommend studying sacred scriptures, studying the Summa Theologica, studying classical reasoning, getting started with classical languages, moral philosophy, and so on. But what they often do is they get themselves into courses like reasoning with no real practical objective for those studies. And you'll find very quickly as you get into Aristotle's On Interpretation or Prior Analytics that you're swimming in an ocean of information. How many different forms of syllogisms exist? The numbers go on and on and on. What's the purpose of that study? That book really becomes a reference. There should be some practical application that's being pursued while studying a subject like reasoning, where it's being applied immediately and used. Now, the end that I always recommend is writing. Students should be writing. Adult students should be writing articles. They should be writing articles that communicate what they're studying. They should be taking up modern problems and seeking the solutions for those problems in their studies. So, for example, if there's an argument that you don't agree with among Catholics, you should seek to solve that argument, to solve that problem through your studies of reasoning and rhetoric and language and history and philosophy, and then write and present that solution. It gives direction and focus. It gives a practical outlet to your studies. If you don't do something like that, you're just going to be treading water in the ocean and have no real sense of achievement or progress in your studies. There has to be a practical outlet. There has to be a practical objective. And when I see adult students, I often see people who talk about studying for the sake of studying, and there's no such thing. There's no such thing as studying for the sake of studying. Having a practical outlet directs your studies and makes them meaningful, allows you to appreciate the value of what you're learning by seeing how it applies to the practical objective that you have in mind. That's what actually gives you some measure to measure things with, how useful it is, how it applies, whether it's useful, and so on. So that's my first recommendation, is always to begin writing or talking on the subjects. Engage with people. Take up problems, take up questions, and seek their solution in your studies. Keep a list of questions and constantly be thinking about them as you read and study. How this, how that, how this, how that might apply in some creative way to the problem. The other problem with adults is they're often too prideful to start writing. They think that they're going to immediately begin to write masterpieces, and they don't understand how much time and experience and revision and rewriting great writers do to finally produce valuable compositions. It's okay to write an article that's not very good and get negative feedback. It's good to get that because that helps you to get better. I posted a talk yesterday on irrational criticism of elite universities, and as I made the talk, as I went through the talk, I knew it wasn't a very good talk. And I even wrote that in the comments under the video. I said, in this video, I have begun to discuss a topic that I want to talk about, but I know that I have not expressed my thoughts very well in this talk. That's just part of the process, and putting ideas out, publishing things, writing things, it makes us vulnerable to criticism. And that's something we have to learn to get past, because that's how we begin to grow. When we begin to write, we find areas or gaps in our learning where we're weak, and they give us immediate goals for our studies. We sense we're weak in this. We sense, I wanted to write an article on this, or I wanted to talk about this, but as I got into it, I realized that I didn't understand when and where the First Continental Congress took place. This happened to me in a recent essay I was writing. Writing is not where we demonstrate our mastery, although ultimately it is. Writing is where we discover our own gaps. We discover our own weaknesses, and that sends us back to our studies with practical objectives. So for adult students, if you're not engaging with some practical objective, you're just going to be treading water. So I'd like to stop there. I hope that that's helpful. If you'd like to talk about these practical objectives, I'm happy to help you with them. But realize that this is a vocational thing. This is a personality thing. Vocation has to do with not just ability, but interest. The two things coming together. Where there's no ability, there can be no vocation. Where there's no interest, there can be no vocation. And so vocation is not something that's told someone to do. A vocation is something that someone has to discover through their own self-examination, their own desires, their own abilities. They can seek advice from others, but ultimately they've got to take upon themselves all of the work and sacrifices of those different fields of study and activity, and there's no one who can make those decisions except the individual. So if you've got some questions I can help with, I'm happy to talk about it, but to ask something like, what should I do, is not a reasonable question. It's not a mystery. What do you like to do? What problems get you upset? What problems would you like to solve in your life? What would you like to establish or accomplish? Think generally. And as you begin to sense things that you're really moved by and passionate about, then begin to work out a set of intermediate tasks by which you can pursue that end. And then you can get into real academic goals and have prioritized studies. So I can't do that for you. You've got to begin that reflection on your own. But as I said, if you've got specific questions you'd like some input on or advice on, I'd be happy to offer it. So I hope that that's helpful. God bless your studies.